At one time or another, all of us ponder an interesting question. What makes some people successful while others fail? Is it just luck? Is it just being in the right place at the right time? Is it as simple as being born into the right family? Is it not what you know, but who you know? Those answers in some cases are correct. But most successful people achieve financial success because they have a plan that they follow. It might be a plan they create for themselves or a plan that has worked for others in the past. Keep this in mind. Most people who fail don't plan to fail, they just fail to plan. Our guest today is an American success story. He's an entrepreneur who learned at an early age the advantages of planning your financial future. He had help from mentors who guided him along the way, but ultimately, his hard work and belief in his plan fueled his success and continues to do so today. He was certainly not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He might tell you he's been lucky along the way, and there might be an element of truth in that statement, but I suspect that the harder he works, the luckier he gets. Please welcome Mr. Doug Ottersberg to Focus on the Future. Good morning, Doug.
Hey, Skip. Glad to be here.
Great to have you. You know, I want to start out this morning with just a statement that I heard recently and get your opinion of it.
All right.
The statement was, from now until forever, I alone am responsible for myself. What meaning does that have for you?
Oh, that means everything to me. There's too many people that spend their life griping about all the things that happen to them. And that puts them in effect, in a world of cause and effect. So something that I learned a long time ago is if you want to be successful, you need to be responsible. Put yourself at cause and create your opportunities, create your world, rather than just complaining that, oh, I'm at the effect of all of these things that I can't control.
Would you say that we've created an entitlement attitude in America today or not? Or is this something that is endemic throughout the world perhaps, or?
Perhaps more so in the United States these days. Certainly it's picking up around the world, but it's really interesting. You can look back into similar economic times that we're having now. It was way worse back in, let's say, the 30s. And those parents that were children that grew up in that hard life, that hard time, what did they say? Well, I want my children to have it better than I did.
Right.
So they did everything for those kids, and those kids grew up. And each succeeding generation to get to where we're at today has had less and less imposed on them in the name of, I want it to be easier for my kids. Until you get to the point where there's really no consequences anymore. There's no responsibility for a lot of folks now, you just hear them, hey, this is my right. They hear that, it's my right to do this, it's my right to do that. Very rarely do you also hear the other R word, it's my responsibility, that goes along with those rights. So yeah, there's this entitlement attitude out there. It's pervasive everywhere in our society.
When you start talking about the word, the other R word, responsibility, it is kind of a scary word. But in your opinion, is responsibility the most important element, personal responsibility?
Yeah. Everything, regardless of what we're talking about here. As I said earlier, we live in a cause and effect world. And when you stand up, when anybody stands up and says, you know what, look, I'm responsible for my life from this moment forward. Doesn't matter what happened in the past. Doesn't matter into what family I was born in. Some people listening to this are like, oh, you don't know what family I was born into. You don't know all the stuff that I had to deal with.
Well, of course you don't.
It's like, no, I don't. And yet I do know that we can choose to be responsible from this moment forward. Forget all the stuff that happened or didn't happen and say, you know what, from this moment, I choose my life. I'm responsible for the outcome that I'm looking for.
Well, I can certainly see that you are in favor of self-reliance.
Sure.
But let's take worst case scenario. There are people who are incapable of working.
Yeah.
There are people, for whatever circumstance has befallen them, are either medically incapable, mentally incapable.
Absolutely.
What would you have our country do with those folks? Just ignore them?
Absolutely not. Those that can help those that can't. And that's something that's been a principle of this country and other countries forever. That's right. And so those of us that have the ability to help those that can't do for themselves, it's our obligation. Now there's another story. Those of us, should we help those that won't help themselves?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So let me ask that.
Okay.
Should we?
Here's how I was taught, and here's what I believe in. One of my teachers, Steve Linder, he taught me that we should give resources to resourcefulness. All right, so he think of it this way: if you go out to the ocean, to one of the like Ocean World or Sea World, one of those places, there's a sign out there that says "Don't feed the dolphins."
Right.
And it's like, well, why not? And it's like, well, if you feed the dolphins, eventually they'll figure out that they don't have to go rustle up some grub for themselves. They'll just show up at the dock and expect to be fed. And that one day when somebody doesn't show up to feed them, well, they'll starve. So
perhaps we've seen a little example of that in Greece of late.
Sure.
With people who were expecting entitlements, didn't get them, and they rioted.
Exactly.
I thought that was really strange, but you're saying this is a natural course of events.
It's happening.
Makes sense, doesn't it?
And so until we stand up for ourselves and say, look, I am responsible for myself, I'm also responsible to contribute to my community, and I'm responsible to help those that can't. Provide the resources.
I'd like to talk a little bit about your simple plan, and I want to say that thank you for allowing us to put that into our student workbook,
sure,
which happens to be the anchor of our Focus on the Future student workbook, which, by the way, can be downloaded online at our site, which is focusonthefuture.tv, for whatever that's worth.
It's worth a lot.
I think so. The plan is called a simple plan. Give us an outline in a simple way so we can understand it.
All right. When I was a younger man, I was starting off in business, and I was fortunate to meet a very wise older gentleman who had been in business, and he took my partners and I literally under his wing and kind of shepherded us through the startup process and the expansion process. And
so this is part of the mentorship process I referred to earlier. Okay.
And one of the things that he taught me was, in business and in life, you have to, as you said earlier, you've got a plan.
Right.
And one of the things that as a business person I hated to do, and I hated it in my life, was to budget. All right, everybody doesn't like, most people do not like to be told what they can't do.
Well, I think you're absolutely right.
And a budget is
really
constrictive.
Yeah.
So he said, think of it this way: do you like to spend money? And it's like, well, yeah, who doesn't? I said, well, think of it this way, then let's plan on how we're going to spend our money before we get it. And he said, if you'll remember these 4 numbers, this plan will stick with you for the rest of your life. It's very simple. So just remember, 100% of what you bring in, that's what you bring in.
Right.
Fair enough. So then if you remember these 3 numbers, 10, 10, 10, 70, then you'll always know how to allocate your resources, your finances. I'm like, well, okay, could you explain a little bit more about that? And he said, sure. 10% of what you bring in, you should give it away.
Okay.
And that's what we talked about, helping those that can't, that whole area.
Right.
10% you should set aside in savings to be invested later.
Okay.
And 10% you should spend on education, or rather than spend, invest in education, so that you'll know what to do with that money you set aside to invest.
And then you live on the 70% that you have left.
You got it.
And I figured that out pretty easily.
You got it. And so the challenge that we've been having is most people have been learning to live on 150% of what they bring in, meaning they're borrowing in order to live and maintain their lifestyle.
That might explain why the average American family has about $8,000 in debt on credit cards, paying, what, 21, 22% interest?
Exactly.
That's got to be a nightmare.
And when I complained, I can't live on, I can barely make it on what I'm making now. He said, listen to me and listen very well. If you'll do for 5 years what most people won't, you could spend the rest of your life doing what most people can't.
That is an amazing story. But I really want to talk about the 10-10-10 a little bit.
Sure.
And get a little bit further clarification. I can certainly understand saving 10%.
Sure.
And we advocate that and Focus on the Future all the time.
Sure.
But we also hear, I can't do that. That's what people tell us. Young people especially. My gosh, I only make $1,500 a month. How do you expect me to save $150? Please, I can't do that.
Sure.
So explain, how do you do that?
All right, well, the first thing, again, is you have to say, I'm responsible, all right? And it's not that we can't do something, it's whether or not we choose to do it, all right? So if there was, like, for example, something that most people, they really want to do, right? They're gonna figure out a way to make that happen.
Sure.
And, one of the things that I know is we all serve a period of financial sacrifice, and I figured I'd much rather serve it when I was young and healthy than wait till I get old and not healthy. I'm not going to wish that on anybody.
No.
But which would you rather do? And so I decided, I made up my mind that, hey, look, I am responsible and I want to do this. Anyone can do the same. They just need to choose to do that.
So what you're saying is it really comes back to self-discipline.
It's a discipline, and regardless of where we're at right now, what I'll tell the people that I work with, my students and clients, is, hey, if you can't do a full 10%, make an effort, do something. It's about creating that habit.
Right.
All right, so let's take a buck, or what do you spend wastefully at Starbucks every day? I mean, how much is that no flip, non-drip, mocha cappuccino with whatever double shot? How much do you spend on that every day?
Makes sense.
If you were just to take that alone and start putting it aside, that'll add up.
That makes a lot of sense.
And once you get in that habit and you start seeing that there, another thing that happens is, wow, you start to feel different about yourself because you've got a little cushion sitting over there. All of a sudden, it's not so scary out there.
Or perhaps it burns a hole in your pocket and you spend it very quickly. Now,
well, that's happened.
How do you avoid that?
Again, it's why are we doing this in the first place? All right, I did this. My reason for doing this was I wanted out of my job. I didn't like the job I was in. That's why I went into business for myself in the first place.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's take this just one step further, because you said save the 10% for investing.
Exactly.
How much do I have to accumulate before I invest?
Well, that's up to each different. Each of us has certain gifts and talents that we were given when we were born.
Right.
And part of our journey in life is to discover what those are. Mm-hmm. And part of what I found worked for me was real estate.
Okay.
And so the first couple of things that I did, they weren't very expensive to get into. There are ways of investing that don't take a whole lot of money.
Right.
So again, it depends. You could, some people, they like stocks. Some people like whatever, businesses. So whatever it takes to get into what you want, that's how long you need to save.
Makes sense. Let's take a look at the next 10% you mentioned, and that would be the 10% to give away. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm familiar with religious organizations that suggest that you tithe 10%.
Sure.
And a lot of folks do that. Is that what you're suggesting?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And whether it goes to your church in the tithe, and this is where it comes from, whether it goes to your favorite charity organization, wherever that money goes, the concept behind it is when you're saying, I'm responsible for my life. I trust in myself enough to take what comes in and give back. And what that does is, you may have heard nature abhors a vacuum.
Right.
So it will fill up with the same energy that you put out.
Okay.
And maybe it sounds hocus pocus. I don't know. All I can tell you is it works. So when you're saying, hey, I trust myself enough to be able to give away stuff, it creates the opposite effect of how many, we know people that they just hang on tightly to everything.
Sure.
They're miserly, if you will.
True.
And what kind of a person are they? Are they the kind of person you want to hang around? Usually not. Kind of uptight, not really in a good mood. We've all seen that kind of example. So by giving away the first 10%, you're demonstrating your trust in being able to bring in that plus much more.
Plus, you could actually choose the charity or the organization to give it to.
Yes.
You could give it to your parents if you wanted to, I suppose.
You could.
I can see a lot of young people doing that.
Absolutely. In fact, in one of the scriptures it says, do this, trust me, try me.
Really? i'll be done. All right, well, let's move on to the last 10%, and that would be education.
Sure.
And this one I really want to get into, because my thought on education is that the further you go, the more education you get, the better off you're going to be.
Right.
But at some point, education ends in my head,
okay,
and the job begins. Not that you don't continue to learn on the job, you do.
Right.
But what are you talking about spending 10% on further education? Why would I do that?
Well, here's the thing that we need to understand. At some point, our education can actually get in the way of our learning.
Well, yeah.
All right. And so it has to be education on the right things. Now, what I'm talking about here is most of the things that I wasn't prepared for in my what you might call normal or standard education. Again, we talked earlier about what should we invest in? How much do we need to invest? Well, that money that we set aside in savings is the best thing to do is go find somebody that's successful at doing whatever you think you might want to do. and get them to teach you how to do that.
Right.
And so you need money to do that, and that's why you've got that 10% set aside.
Where do you find these people?
So for example, if you ever go down to the bookstore, if there are any left by the time we see this, or go to Amazon, for example, in my path, I was interested in real estate investing.
Right.
So I went to the library, I went to the store, I bought all the books I could find on real estate investing. I subscribed to newsletters. That takes money. Pretty soon I found out that there were people that actually taught seminars, and those I needed the tuition to pay to go to those as well. And so anything that we're interested in pretty much anymore, the verb is Google it, and that's what I do.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me now that you've explained it, but I'm still a little bit confused,
Sure.
all right? I can understand that you've got this 10%. What if I don't spend it in 1 year on
Sure.
that, or I don't spend it in 5 years?
Sure.
So I've accumulated a lot of money. Can I move that to my investment fund instead?
You could. Again, these are guidelines.
Right.
All right. And so a good plan is always a flexible plan.
Right.
And yet here's something that I will tell you over the years as I've followed this plan. I'm at a point now where that 10% set aside is not so important as much as it used to be.
Right.
Because over the years, what ends up happening is that 70% that I needed to live on, well, that starts to go down. All right. Because of following this plan, the income has gone up. So 70% of what the income is a whole lot. And if you lived on that, you'd be really just wasting a lot of money.
I got you.
You got it?
I got
so
it.
now, at that point, then, talking about helping those that can't, helping those that won't, well, now we have more money, and instead of just giving away 10%, how much did Carnegie give away in the early 1900s?
Well, that's true, and
Boatloads.
that's probably why people form their own private foundations.
Exactly.
And actually, yeah, that makes a lot of sense
because
to me too.
Life now becomes about, hey, let's give back.
So, bottom line here is that you would suggest, regardless of what kind of plan you have, whether it's the 70, 10, 10, 10, or something or another variation of it,
Sure.
your bottom line suggestion to young folks would be what?
Plan in an intelligent way before you spend your money, before you invest your money, how you're going to do it.
I think that's great advice. Thanks for being with us today.
My
Great
pleasure.
to see you again, as always.
Thanks.
Well, Emily, what'd you think, kid?
I thought that was great. I love Doug. I think he's got great information. I love the fact that he espouses hard work, responsibility in order to achieve financial success. It makes sense to me.
Boy, it does me too. And when you start talking about personal responsibility, there's a lot to go with that, because he talked about a lot of different things. But I think bottom line is that if you're personally responsible, you got a plan that you're implementing and you're working on all the time.
I think it makes sense, and something that he hit on was those that have help those that can't help themselves. And I think that makes sense because we have this mentality of, well, if somebody has a problem, if somebody needs help, that's the responsibility of the state government or the federal government. But I think it makes sense. You should be responsible in your community, help those folks out. It makes wonderful sense. The other thing that I love, he calls it a simple plan. And those figures that he has, 10, 10, 10, 70, it really is just that. It's very simple. It's easy to follow, and it makes sense. I personally try to emulate that plan in my daily life. And the bottom line to me is whatever your plan is, it doesn't really matter if you want to stick to Doug's numbers or not. Have a plan and just stick to it.
What I liked, that I thought was great, he said that people hate the budget. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, if that's not the truth. I can remember the first time I set up a budget, I threw it out after about 2 weeks. But you budget, don't you?
I do budget, and I think it's something that you have to do. Most of us hate to do it, but you have to do it. See where the money's going, see how much is coming in. It makes sense. You're able to stick to your plan.
Well, I thought it was a great interview and a nice start to this semester's offering, as a matter of fact.
I think it's great. I'm very excited about this semester.
And we will be right back with the Stock Market Corner.
Thanks, guys. Hi, welcome to the Stock Market Corner. I'm Emily New alongside Tom Crow. Welcome, Tom. Thanks for being here. We added Tom to our cast here at Focus on the Future this last year, and he is our expert on all things regarding markets, stocks, bonds, the economy, all sorts of great stuff. He has a ton of information for all of us, so make sure that you're listening closely. Tom, will you tell us a little bit about yourself and your history?
Yeah, sure. I have been a registered investment advisor since 2000. Own and operate Crow Financial Advisors, which is a small independent investment advisory firm. And as I understand it, my goal here is to get you all to start thinking like investors, start looking for risk and looking for how to avoid it. You're going to work hard to save up money and invest it, and you don't just want to throw it away.
You're absolutely right, and I'm learning right alongside all of you guys, so please excuse my inexperience in this. Tom's teaching me as well as you guys. So I want to talk a little bit, Tom. Last week a report came out, the DOL, the Department of Labor, and they reported that no new jobs were added at all in the month of August. And as a result, we saw a lot of the markets just kind of spiraling as a result of that. Would you say that's an indicator of what folks, analysts, are calling a double dip recession?
It's an indication of weakness. Whether or not it's an actual double dip recession or not, a recession is a technical term that the economists use that means you've had 3 down quarters in a row in terms of GDP. For the first time since 1945, I think we had 0 jobs created.
Wow.
The markets decided to tank on that, but there was just not even a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, we were talking about jobs lost.
Right.
So if you want to be an optimist in some form of this, at least it was 0, we didn't lose any jobs. We actually managed to create enough to offset the government layoffs and other things that were happening to just end up at a net 0 job. So it's kind of no better, no worse.
Now that same report that the Department of Labor put out also said that we've been experiencing unemployment at 9% over the last 24 out of 26 months. What do you say to that in terms of incorporating that into a double dip recession?
Well, it's high and it's uncomfortably high. The conventional wisdom used to be that full unemployment was 5%. And that was just people coming into the workforce for the first time, either out of college or with their trade school degrees, and also people between jobs. And that 5% unemployment would account for that. Right now we're seeing not only 9.1, 9.2% unemployment, but a lot of people have actually exhausted their 99 weeks of unemployment benefits and fallen off the end, and they're not even looking for work anymore. They're so discouraged. So the number of people unemployed and the rate may even be a little bit artificially low.
Because they're not taking into account those folks who've basically stopped looking for
They've
jobs.
fallen off the charts.
Okay.
Yeah, and they are going to come back most of them will come back at some point.
Right.
So what you'll see when the economy starts creating jobs again, you'll see that number of monthly jobs created is going to start to climb up. You may also see the unemployment rate start to climb up. We might go back above 10% as more people come back to the workforce and start looking for jobs again.
Now, what about the term underemployed? I've heard people mention that, when mentioning the 9% figure of unemployed or underemployed. How does underemployed factor into that and those who've stopped looking?
When they include that, I think that number goes out to around 16 or 17%.
Oh,
That's
wow.
folks who are forced to either work part-time or at a reduced wage or salary just to stay employed, but it's not full-time employment, which is what they were seeking or what they would prefer.
And not what they're accustomed to
Exactly.
in their typical profession. Okay, now we're talking about what's happening here, nationally within the U.S., but this is also a situation that we're seeing around the world. I remember last semester, Skip and I talked about what was happening in Greece, what was happening potentially in Portugal. How do you think what's happening in the U.S. translate to what's happening across the globe?
Well, we can't help but affect what goes on across the globe.
Right.
When you look at the size of the U.S. economy, we are still 3 times that of China, which is the second one coming up.
Wow.
The European Union combined is a little bit larger, but if you take the individual countries, they're all much smaller. So anything that happens in the U.S. has ripple effects across the globe. Head of Deutsche Bank just yesterday said he did not have a lot of confidence in the small European banks. The euro may be in jeopardy. Everybody's complaining about the dollar maintaining its reserve currency status. The Chinese don't want to get paid in dollars anymore. There's all kinds of speculation as to who's going to win this. I think it's all based in the uncertainty and fear of just how long this is likely to last.
Well, I know there's been some talk about the euro and the euro against the dollar. I was in Spain a couple of months ago. I have a friend that's over in Europe right now. We're seeing how the dollar compares to the euro, how the euro works with the fact that there's so many countries, involved in the euro, but then it's also those smaller banks, as you just mentioned.
Right.
Do you think what we're seeing with the dollar and what's happening with inflation here is happening with the euro and maybe on a bigger scale because so many more countries are involved in that?
It probably is. The euro actually acts as kind of a clearinghouse to average out some of the individual countries' strengths and weaknesses.
Okay.
Where you have the German economy might be a little bit stronger, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, we're all a little bit weaker.
Right.
But since they're all contributing to the euro, that kind of acts as a big averaging basket to put everything in. So you might take some of the extremes out of it. In terms of a weaker U.S. dollar, which will continue to be weak as long as we continue to print money and borrow it, pay debt, take on more debt, sell more bonds. as long as our Fed decides to keep interest rates low, we've got to start seeing some inflationary pressure, some continued weakness in the dollar. The European banks have not been afraid to raise rates quite so much, so they're kind of keeping a lid on that inflation a little bit better. But the overall economic weakness is contributing just to a general lack of confidence.
Now, you mentioned the Fed and what we're seeing with printing money and what we've done in the past. We've had QE2 and some of these other factors that the Fed has tried to basically boost up our economy a little bit. Is there any news coming out of the Fed, what they're looking to do? Interest rates are still low, as you mentioned. What do you see happening with the Fed and what they could potentially do to help stimulate our economy?
One thing to keep in mind is it's not the Fed's job to help the market. It's the Fed's job to protect the economy. So just because we have a bad market doesn't mean the Fed's automatically going to jump in and try and save everyone. The Fed may or may not go for another round of quantitative easing. It depends on what kind of pressure they get from the White House, what Congress directs them to do. They are an independent agency, but they are affected by outside pressure.
Do you think that we're going to see interest rates rising? I mean, they've been so low for so long, it seems the only place that they can go is up at this point.
We almost have to at some point. It's just a matter of when. Some people have been waiting for it for years already.
Right. Well, let's just shift that into talking a little bit more about investment. And as you talked about having our students be a little bit more wise when it comes to investing, and starting young obviously is the best time when you have some of that disposable income. What exactly is a stock dividend?
A dividend is a cash payment or a reinvestment in additional stock that the company will give you for owning their stock.
Okay.
And like I said at the beginning, I want to help you avoid risk in that. So what you want to do is your due diligence, looking into the company. You want to make sure that the company has enough cash on hand to support the dividend that they say they're going to pay you.
Okay.
If your dividend is going to be 20 cents a share and they've only got 18 cents a share in cash on the books, that means they're going to have to borrow money. And we all know what borrowing causes. I mean, this entire global problem, we've got politics, politicians, everybody aside, is because we have irresponsible use of debt. That applies to corporations, countries, and individuals as well.
Well, we're all hoping that responsibility and printing of the money and the debt situation is going to get better. The due diligence makes complete sense to me. So we're wanting to look at not just the price of the stock, not just the dividend, but some of this other information, as you've mentioned to me before, is readily available on things like Yahoo Finance that you can find out for yourself.
Yeah.
Maybe ask somebody that is a registered broker, such as yourself, that has this information that can be trusted to do that.
We'll tell you where to find it.
That's great. I think this is wonderful information. I'm learning right alongside you guys. I'm enjoying this. This is great stuff. Tom, that's all the time we have today, but we'll be back next week. But stick with us first for a budget tip. We'll see you soon. Hi everyone, I'm Emily, and I'll be your budgeting guide this semester. Today I want to discuss starting your budget from the bottom up. What exactly do I mean? Simply this, that many of us fail to think about budgeting when planning our financial future. If you've never thought about planning your financial future, well, it started the second that you had money in your hot little hand. Budgeting should be the first step toward a brighter financial future, and it's not as complicated or as painful as you may think. Over the next several weeks, I'll be offering you a budget tip to make budgeting your income fun and workable. So, here's my first tip. Pay yourself first. All of us are going to have an income, and all of us are going to have bills. It seems to be pretty much human nature to spend everything that we make. The more money we earn, the more we tend to consume. At the end of the month, we're lucky to have anything left over for savings. So, when an emergency occurs, or we make a major purchase like a new vehicle or a home or a major appliance, we end up using our credit, which increases our debt load on our monthly bills. The solution then is pretty simple. Decide what percentage of your net income you'll live on every month. We suggest that you choose between 70 to 90%, but that depends on you, your personal preferences, and your circumstances. The main thing to remember is that you simply can't afford to live on 100% of your net income. Nobody can. Believe me, that's a recipe for inevitable financial disaster. Please note that I said your net income. That means the income that you make after all the deductions from your income, like income tax, FICA, Medicare, and other payroll deductions. So the first bill that you pay each month should be the bill that you owe to yourself, ideally about 10 to 30%. Before you know it, you'll have a nice amount saved that you can use for anything you need. Oh, and by the way, if you can save the money through a payroll deduction or an automatic deduction from your checking into your savings account, that's the best and easiest way to become a regular saver. Good luck saving. I know you can do it.
And now, here are this week's questions for classroom discussion. Question number 1. Explain the simple plan. Does it make sense? Why or why not? Secondly, what are stock dividends?
And finally, which bill should you pay first every month?